Oh, the snakes crawl at night. That's what they say when the sun goes down. Then the snake will play. So a shadow slipped away from my house. So I hurried straight and looked in her driveway. But I found out that it was my love inspired.
Okay, today's discussion has to do with my father, and his name is John Kelly Harwood Sr. So during the Vietnam War, he was stationed in Guam. So here is a photograph. He had this photograph in a frame. He looks like he's in his early 20s, and he's identified as a radio man class A. So I always thought he had a smug look on his face. So a while ago, in 2012, I took a photograph of this picture in a frame, and I zoomed in on his face. And as you can see, he looks like he's been brainwashed. He looks like he's a victim of mind control. This is not how he usually looks. And he has a bizarre look on his face. I don't know if any of you care to psychoanalyze this and try to figure out this expression on his face, but he does not look happy at all. He looks confused and almost ashamed. So this is what the United States Navy was doing to young men in Guam during the Vietnam War. So he never told me much. As with many military guys I know, they don't tell you much when you ask them questions about their military service. So I don't know much about what he did on the island of Guam, in the country of Guam. But he said he was trained to use the radio. So he said that after his service, after he was discharged from the Navy, he took a tour around the world. And he went to Africa, he went to India, he went to parts of Asia. I think he went to South America. And I think he did this in a period of 1 year. And he had, I think, 8mm footage film of this. And he showed my mother and I some of this when I was real young. He set up the film projector and he showed us parts of his trip around the world. So my mother met him sometime after this. I guess they were in their early to mid-20s. And this was kind of at the end of the 60s or the start of the 70s. And she met him as she worked in a department store. And I think either he worked there or he was a salesman, and he went in there to talk to her. And she said they went out a couple of times and then he had to leave. He had to move or something like that, or go somewhere due to his job. And she did not see him for a year. But all she could think about during his absence was my father. She missed him. And so he re-entered her life a year later. They met each other again, just by chance, I guess. And soon after, they were married. And in 1975, they had a son. And that son is me. And my name is John Kelly Harwood Jr. So I wish I had this. I wish I had this photograph of my father holding me when I was an infant. I guess I was only a few months old. And he's seated in a chair. And he's holding me. And the expression on his face is very disturbing. He looks horrified. He looks revolted that he's holding a baby. I have never seen a more unnatural expression on a person's face that is holding a baby than on my father in this photograph. My mother moved a couple of times, and she lost a lot of the stuff in the moving. When she moved from Connecticut to California, the moving company parked 2 pods out on her driveway. She filled up both of those pods. They came and picked it up and they shipped it to California for her. And they lost one of those pods. So I do not know if they still have all those photographs. I believe she says that she lost a lot of the photo albums. But I will give her a call and see if she has that photograph, because that photograph is very telling about the nature of my father and how my father really is. There's a picture of me when I'm in my late 20s and I'm in the hospital and I'm holding my daughter. She's only a few days old. I'm a little nervous, but I'm really happy to be holding my daughter. And you could see that in this photograph. My father has a disturbed and a revolted expression on his face, like he's almost angry to be holding his son. If he could say something in this photograph, if his expression could speak, his expression would say, I shouldn't be around kids. I have no business raising a son. I don't like children. I don't like my son. And I don't like the situation I am in. That is what his expression says in this photograph. So I remember seeing that a long time ago when I was just a kid, maybe 11 or 12 years old. And I said to my mom, why does dad look like that? And she goes, oh, he was just so nervous. But that expression isn't nervous. That is something else entirely. So my father did not get along good with people. That was how my mother described him. And he seemed to go out of his way to create problems with the people in his social life and the people in his family. It was almost who he was or what he was trained to be, which is to go around and cause problems for people. It was his personality. So I remember going on drives. We would take little trips when I was a little kid. And I remember my father continuously doing things that got my mother upset. He would do dangerous things with the car. He would get them lost. And he would do unexpected things that would constantly disturb my mom. So I just heard about these stories recently from my mom. I knew I had to do a report on my father. So I asked my mom a few questions about my dad. And she told me things that I didn't hear before and kind of proved to me beyond a shadow of a doubt that my father had alternative motives for marrying my mother. So she said when I was just a few months old, they decided to take the car and drive north of White Plains. When I was born, my parents lived in a small apartment in Hartsdale, New York. Later on, when I was around 5 or 6, they moved to a house in White Plains, New York. And White Plains is a city just outside of New York City. So I guess they went kind of north and they drove into the country. And she said I was just a little kid. I was just 6, 7 months old. And my father is driving and he's running out of gas. And she says, you got to stop at the next gas station because we're running out of gas. And he says, yeah, I know. And the gas station came up and he drove right past it. And they continue on. And they continue on with their drive through the country. So this happens 2 or 3 times. He refuses to stop at little gas stations as they're driving. And eventually the light comes on to warn them that they're about to run out of gas. And another gas station comes up and he goes right past it. So he drives for a few more miles up the road. And my mom's like, you really should turn around and go back there. And he said, no, we'll come to another gas station soon enough. Don't worry about it. And so the car runs out of gas. And she says she cannot really remember where they were, but they were out in the middle of nowhere. And so my father says, okay, you wait here with the car and I'll be right back. And he walks down the road. So she says that she's stranded there on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere with their 5 or 6 month-old child. So she says that he was gone for 2 or 3 hours. And eventually, right before dusk, right before it started getting dark out, he comes walking up the street with a gas can. So my question to everybody is, at what point do you stop to get gas? When your car is about a quarter tank? When your car is reaching like 1/8 of a tank? When it's getting to be empty? When the indicator light is on? And does having a young newborn kid in the car do anything to affect your decisions on making sure that you have enough gas in the car? So why he would run out of gas and leave his young wife, she was 25 years old, and a 5-month-old kid out in the middle of nowhere, and then take off on foot. He almost did that on purpose by refusing to stop at all these gas stations until the car ran out of gas. It was almost as if he planned to do that. So next, it was a few months later, and I was like 1 year old, and my father and my mother traveled to Missouri to visit my grandmother. So my grandmother met us at the airport, and the plan was for my mom and dad to rent a car, and that way they could use the car to take a little trip by themselves in Missouri and not leave my grandmother without a car. So my dad rented a car and then said, why don't you and John go in one car and I could sit up here with Rowena. Rowena was what he called his mom. She did not want to be called mom or grandmom. Her name is Rowena, and she wanted to be called Rowena. And this is a photograph of my grandmother, Rowena Harwood, and she's joking around at a party, and someone's taking her photograph, and so she's kind of subliminally flicking them off with both of her hands held up kind of like horns. So she's quite a character. So anyway, my grandmother shows up. My dad gets into Rowena's car and says to my mom, "You go with John and you follow us to Rowena's residence." And at that point, he steps on the gas and tries to lose her. So he's driving his mom's car, and my mom is following him in the rental car with a kid that's about a year old. And my dad's doing everything to lose her in Missouri. My mom has never been to Missouri before. She does not know her way around Missouri. She has never been to her mother-in-law's house, and my father's trying to lose her. And my mom said she had to run like 3 or 4 red lights to keep up with him because he was going out of his way to lose her. So that was back before there were cell phones. So I wonder if my mom even had Rowena's home number or would know what to do if my father did lose her in Missouri. Then she'll be in a rental car with her 1-year-old child in Missouri, in a state that she doesn't know very well, never been to, and she has no idea where her mother-in-law even lives. So this is not normal things that a husband and a young father would do. Try to get his young 25 or 26-year-old wife lost with their 1-year-old son. That sounds like somebody who is going out of his way to sabotage her life, and he could care less about his son. So if that isn't bad enough, my mother told me the king of all horror stories. This should be in a horror movie about a young lady who meets a guy, gets married with him, has a kid, and this guy for some reason is going out of his way to kill his family. So my mother did not say this the same way I'm telling it. My mother's the type of person that wants to come up with excuses why her ex-husband would behave this way. And she would say that he's nervous or he drives too fast. So she would come up with a bunch of excuses for all of this. So my mother said that the power ran out one day in the house. The power went off. And so they had a furnace that was powered by gas. They had a gas line that comes through the wall and attaches to their furnace. It's a city gas line. It's not like connected to a gas tank that would be in someone's backyard. So when the power went out, everything shut off. The lights went off, the furnace shut down. And my mother's in there. And it is a winter day. And I guess 5, 6, 7 hours go by. And it starts to get kind of cold. So she calls up my father at work. And he worked in New York City, I think. And she called him up at the office. And she told him the power went out. It's been out for a few hours now and the house is getting cold. And he says, well, we'll just go start the furnace. And she goes, how do you do that? And he said, you go press the override button. And he told her to go downstairs to where the furnace is and to hit the override button. So for those of you who do not know furnaces too well, there are 2 parts to a furnace. There is the electrical part, and the electrical part works on electricity, and the electrical part will work something like the pump to circulate all the water. The electrical part of the furnace will work all the sensors. However, the gas line will ignite the flame, and the flame is going to heat the water. And then the electrical part works the pump that circulates the heated water around the house. So if ever you have a power outage, the whole thing shuts down for safety. And the last thing you want to do is hit some override button that starts the pilot light so you can start heating the water when the water cannot be circulated because there's no electricity. There's nothing powering the pump. So you have a bunch of still water that's getting heated, and that could potentially cause an explosion. That is why the sensors will tell the whole furnace to shut down in the event of a power outage. So my dad is telling her how to hit the override button so that the pilot light comes back on, even though the rest of the furnace has no power to it. So she goes upstairs, and after about a half hour, she says the whole furnace begins shaking. It makes this terrible racket, and all the pipes and everything starts shaking. And once again, she's a young woman. She's like 27 years old. And I think at this time she had me. I was like 4 or 5 years old. And she had my brother, who had just barely been born. So she grabs me and my brother and she runs next door to the neighbor's house. And she says there's something wrong with the furnace. It's shaking. And he looks in the downstairs door. And he said, this is getting ready to explode. You got to get out of the house and call the fire department. And after a certain amount of time, the fire department shows up and they shut everything down. And they say that the furnace is destroyed and that my mom is lucky that there wasn't an explosion and a fire in the house. So I realized that my dad likes to hurt people, especially little people, when I was a little bit older, around 10 years old. And we went back to Missouri to visit my grandmother. And this is the first time I met my 2 young cousins. And one of my cousins' name is Adam Perdue. And he's from Arkansas. And we were staying at a little hotel. I forget if it was in the Ozarks, but we had plans to go to Silver Dollar City, which is an amusement park in Missouri. And he drove up with his mom named Phillis Ann. So my dad decided that he wanted to go on a horseback ride. So he rented like 3 horses. My brother got on one, I got on one, and he wanted Adam, who was the same age as my brother, I would say around 5 or 6 years old, to get on a horseback with him. So my brother's in front, I'm in the middle, and I could see my dad and Adam behind me. And there's a whole group of people on horseback, and we're going along a trail. And my cousin, I thought, was making a face because he wanted his own horse. But he was up on the horse, and he was in the front of the saddle. And he's sitting there squinting his eyes in pain. And I could hear him complaining. And I really couldn't hear what he was saying, but he was complaining the whole time. And I thought it was because he didn't want to be on a horse with my father. But I later found out that it was because my father was pushing him toward the front of the saddle. So I don't know all the parts to the saddle, but there is a thing that comes up in front that you kind of hold on to. It's like a handle right between your legs. So my father was pushing the kid up. So that was kind of jabbing him in his stomach and private area for a whole half hour or hour horseback ride. And he was kind of whimpering or crying when we got off the horses. And I asked him, why are you crying, Adam? You wanted your own horse? He goes, no, I couldn't breathe. The saddle was hurting my legs. I didn't have enough room on the horse. So this all goes back to the infamous uncle. So when I went jet skiing with Terry, he flipped me off the jet ski 6 or 7 times without a life jacket. But as soon as his son showed up, as soon as my aunt dropped off his young son, Terry was on his best behavior. So Terry liked to take his anger out on his nephew. So as far as I could remember, my father was never physically abusive, but he was doing the same thing by taking his anger out on his cousin, his young cousin, when Adam was around 5 or 6 years old.